Were you successful? I really recommend that you have a look at those last lectures again to fully understand how you manage entered values, validity, and touch state, and combine that all with different event handlers to make sure that you deliver the user experience you wanna deliver. Now here, in this case, I will continue with that finished custom hook which we built already. I will not build up that entire logic again from scratch, because I feel like I would basically just be wasting your time if I did that, because it's just what we did in the previous lectures. But I do want to apply the custom hook here one more time to really show you how you could do that in a brand new empty form. And therefore, we start by importing use input from, going up one level, hooks use input. We then, of course, call use input here. And we call it 3 times because we have 3 inputs here. Now, the validation logic for these 3 inputs is up to you. I didn't give you any restrictions or guidance there. But it makes sense to ensure that these inputs aren't empty and that the email address is an email address. So for that, for the first 2 inputs, I'll check if the value we're getting is not empty if we trim it. And since I'll use the same function here, rather than copy and pasting it like this, I will create a new function outside of the component function, because that's not a function that needs to be rebuilt if the component is rebuilt. And I will name it isNotEmpty, store my function in this constant, and then just pass this constant here, which holds this function in the end. So this is really just the function outsourced into a separate constant. And I can do something similar for the email, isEmail. And here I get a value and check that this includes an @ symbol. And then I pass isEmail to the third use input call. Now the custom hook returns an object, as we learned, and that object is full of data which we can use. For example, it contains the value, and we might want to use the value here to be able to reset it once the form is submitted. So here, this is for my first input. I'll have the first name value. Then we get isValid, so this is first name isValid. And I'm assigning these aliases here because I'm going to extract the same keys 2 more times. So we need aliases to avoid name clashes. And here we also get the value change handler, which I'll alias with first name change handler. I get the input blur handler, which I pull out, which I alias with first name blur handler. And the reset function, which I'll alias with reset first name, like this. And then I'll copy this here, this code, and repeat this here for the second use input call. But of course, here it's the last name value, and the last name is valid. And here it's therefore also last name change handler and last name blur handler and reset last name. And then copy and paste it one more time for the last input, and that's the email value, and the email is valid. And here it's the email change handler and the email blur handler, and here is reset email. And now with that all done, we can go down to the JSX code, and on the first input, for example, bind our first name value. For onChange, we bind first name change handler, and for onBlur, we bind the first name blur handler, like this. Then for the second input, we bind value to last name value, onChange to last name change handler, and onBlur, unsurprisingly, to last name blur handler. And then here for this input, I bind my value to email value, onChange to the email change handler, and onBlur to the email blur handler. Now, I also want to show error messages if appropriate, and I want to show different class names or add different class names, and I also want to disable the submit button if the form is invalid. So let's start with the class names and the error texts. For this, there's one other field we can extract, and that's the has error field, which I'll store in a first name has error alias. And here on the second use input call, it's last name has error. And here on the third custom hook usage, it's email has error. And it's this has error field which we can now use because now we can infer those class names, for example. Here I have my first name classes, and for that I'll take my first name has error key, and if I have an error, I'll add a class of form-control invalid, otherwise just form control, and I will repeat this error for last name classes and email classes. And here we then have the last name has error and email has error. And then here we bind our first name classes, and on the second div we bind the last name classes, and on that last div we bind the email classes. Now, for the error messages, we simply go to the first input where we might need an error message like, please enter a first name. And here we check if first name has error, and if that's the case, we show this paragraph, otherwise not. And I then copy that logic to the second input where I say, please enter a last name, and I check for last name has error. And we copy it one more time to the email address where I check for email has error, and I say, please enter a valid email address. So now that's all wired up. Now for the overall form validity, we can again derive that state. We can add a form is valid state, which initially is false. And then we check if the first name is valid and the last name is valid and the email is valid, and all three have to be valid, and only if they are all three valid, I'll set form is valid to true. If at least one of them is not valid, the form will stay invalid. So now we have the form is valid state. We can use that to disable the button, for example, to set disabled to not form is valid. If the form is not valid, the button is disabled. Last but not least, for the form submission, which I also want to add here, I'll add the onSubmit handler and then simply add a new function here. Submit handler could be the name, where I get an event. And as you learned, we call event prevent default here to prevent that browser default of sending a request. And then I check if the form is not valid. And if it's not valid, I return. And that's, by the way, new. In simple input, I didn't do that in the form submission handler. There, I was still checking for the entered name only. And that was an oversight from my side. But of course, we can't even reach that handler since the button is disabled anyways. Nonetheless, adding that extra check here might make sense because the user could theoretically enable the button with the dev tools, which of course is not really what the user should do, but it could be done. So having the extra validation step in here still also could make sense. And then thereafter, if the form is valid and we made it past this check, I will console log submitted, and then also console log my values. So the first name value, the last name value, and the email value. And then I will call reset first name, reset last name, and reset email. Now we can wire up the submit handler here, and we should be good to go. If we save everything and go back here, the button is grayed out by default. If I click in there, I get this error, and this error, and this error, and the errors are not red because I forgot to assign the right CSS class here. On these paragraphs, we should add a CSS class of error-text. So make sure you add this on the first name error paragraph and the last name paragraph and the email error paragraph. Now they are red. And of course, if I enter valid values here, then this becomes submittable. And if we open the DevTools and I click submit, I see submitted, I see the entered values, and it's reset. And again, it's working as before now. So this is looking good now. And now we applied our custom hook and what we learned to this new form as well.